Hi, and thank you for joining us today as we dive into the topic of how to prepare for the next cybersecurity attack, looking at readiness, resiliency, and insurance. I'm Mary Beth Hamilton, Vice President of Marketing here at DataPrize, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We expect to run approximately 45 minutes to an hour. The webinar is being recorded, so post-webinar, we will provide you a copy of the recording as well as the slides. And we would love questions, so we ask that you use the Q&A function in the GoToWebinar interface to submit those, and I will ask those to our speakers as we near the end of the conversation. First, a little bit about the two companies that are hosting this webinar. First, DataPrize, in case you don't know us, we were founded in 1995, and today we are a leading strategic IT solution provider to mid-market IT leaders across the United States. We provide unbeatable IT services across a range of areas, from best-in-class managed cybersecurity, hence we're having this conversation, to network, infrastructure, collaboration, and end-user solutions. We are also thrilled to share that we just announced an acquisition of a company called Wireless Watchdogs, who's the leader in managed mobility services. And given today's landscape where IoT devices are so deeply woven in the fabric of business and cybersecurity, the addition of Wireless Watchdogs really broadens our portfolio and allows us to continue to provide end-to-end solutions to our clients and the market as a whole. Also joining us today, we have Risk Cooperative. And Risk Cooperative is a minority-owned strategy insurance brokerage and risk advisory firm licensed to originate, place, and service innovative risk transfer and insurance solutions across all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico and DC. They have extensive experience across all classes of insurance, including life, health, property, specialty risks, and of course, cybersecurity. So glad to have them joining us here today. So who are the two individuals joining me? I have DataPrize's CEO, Steve Lewis. He is an accomplished IT leader with 3 decades of experience helping build industry-leading technology and intense companies. He oversees DataPrize's strategic vision, growth, and works with our clients on a regular basis on a range of business and strategy needs. Also, I have Andres Franzetti, the CEO of Risk Cooperative and co-founder. In his role, he oversees the firm's overall operations and strategy, and he brings a wide range of experience and specialization in helping multinational organizations address complex risks. So thank you both for joining me today. Next, the good stuff that we're going to get into. The agenda, we're going to be talking about the current risk landscape, and how that is impacting the insurance market. We will also talk about building strategies for resiliency today and tomorrow, and then get even deeper into how is that impacting the considerations around cyber insurance, coverage, crisis management, and a whole host of other things that organizations need to be thinking about as part of building resilience. So with that, Steve, let me bring you in to share what you've seen and are seeing across the landscape when it comes to risks facing organizations.
Thank you. At the danger of sort of stating the obvious, the cyber landscape out there is just incredibly risky. All of you who read the newspaper or watch television know this. Attackers are basically doubling down. For a very simple reason. It works, it's profitable. And what you need to know about most of these hackers is they're either state sponsored, in which case there's a political agenda and it's working, ergo they're going to do more. Or it's a job. Quite frankly, it's a very, very lucrative job. And for many unethical people, they can go into the dark web, pull down toolkits, get in the ransomware business, and hey, you could be Mary Kay or you could be Hacker K. And so the threat is intensifying at a really alarming rate. And again, you only need to pick up a paper to know that the costs are significant. The average cost of a malware attack, sure, $2.4 million, but the actual implications for many of your businesses are far, far more profound. Just ask the folks, who were shut down their gas pipeline, or, we have a company that we're aware of that is in the construction business, which they can't transact business because under the Kaseya attack, they got all their project management files locked, can't do projects. So the landscape is real. We can no longer ignore it, and to do so, you do so at your peril. So, simply put. Mary Beth?
Perfect. Yeah. So, Andres, can you talk about how that is impacting the cyber insurance aspect of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks for the opportunity to participate today. And I echo, what Steve said. It's the landscape has shifted, and it's grown increasingly more complex and challenging, even for the folks that are in the business of risk, right? Myself, the insurers. And it used to be a couple of years ago, cyber used to be about data breaches, and Steve, you probably can extend much more on this area, but it used to be the big names, the Targets, the Equifaxes, the OPMs that would have large-scale data breaches, and it was around PII, PHI, and data, and it was more about that type of exposure. And as you highlighted, Steve, spot on, what we're seeing from the insurers is that the risks and the drivers of loss have shifted right now. So right now it is more about business interruption. It is more about shutting down organizations' operations around chaos, around ransomware, and the costs have gone up. So you can see on the screen right now, Allianz Insurance, which is one of the larger writers of cyber, has done a review and survey of about 1,700 cyber policies that they hold. And they've seen that business interruption coverage, which is again covering that disruption to the organization's operations, has been the leading driver in claims. They've also seen the number of claims that they're filing explode over the last year. With COVID and teleworking, it's created added complexity, added areas of exposure and vulnerabilities. So 2020, in the first 9 months, saw the number of claims almost exceed what the total claims that they had in 2019. And the cost of ransomware are increasing. So in addition to this complex landscape, they're really struggling with getting a hold of this type of new environment and new threats. And if you go into the next slide, you can see that it's having an impact also on the profitability. So cyber insurance used to be, and still is, an area of high growth. Every carrier, now some probably in retrospect, not so, a little bit begrudgingly, but got into cyber because they thought it was a high growth area. And what we saw was the larger companies were taking up insurance, and the middle market and smaller companies weren't. As cyber started becoming more prevalent, they started buying more policies, but the rate of losses and the rate of claims has outpaced that. So they're still struggling to make a profit. The loss ratio has been about 73%, which, for those that don't understand the way insurance works, means that there's 27% left for the insurers to pay out commissions to anybody, to pay out their operating expenses and all other costs associated with the program. And it effectively is a loss leader for them. So we're seeing now that they're really struggling with understanding cyber risk. They're really struggling with how to price cyber risk. And it's having an impact on how they're taking on new clients. And it highlights the urgency for, kind of the need of more professionals, more expertise, and more providers like DataPrize, I think, to come in and help. And so we're seeing some of the changes in the marketplace right now. Some of our clients, we're seeing, if you get a 35% rate increase on your insurance policy, you should be happy. You're getting away with a very low cost increases. We're seeing clients that have 100% or more rate increases. And we're seeing the insurance market in certain areas that they deem to be high risk, whether it's financial services, healthcare, they're either reducing the amount of coverage that they're providing to those groups, or they're outright exiting those groups. Similarly, the middle market and smaller companies, they're seeing more limited access to cyber insurance, and they're seeing more restricted coverage. We're seeing events like SolarWinds and Kaseya requiring stricter patch management systems, protocols, policies. We're seeing that companies that don't have robust cybersecurity protocols and frameworks, or even services from whether it's internal or external providers, we're seeing that they're not even able to apply for insurance. Insurers won't even look at their applications and give them a quote. So the market has gotten extremely challenging, and the access of insurance has gotten extremely limited. So it's very tough out there.
Perfect. And that leads us perfectly into, as you're talking about, so what is a robust cybersecurity? How do you build resiliency? And what are they looking at? Steve, if you can take us through, what does that mean? What does resiliency look like?
Yeah, and I don't want to make this sort of a technical diatribe, but let's just sort of start again with the obvious. Effective, resilient IT infrastructure is now table stakes. Honestly, for the past decade, I've felt a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. And I'd sit and I do 50, 60 speeches a year, and I'd go, cyber's important. And the audience would go, yes, but we're going to self-insure. And I'd go, but cyber's important. And starting about 2 years ago, people went, you're right. Maybe we should do something about that. And so people are getting it. But again, to sort of restate the obvious, effective cybersecurity is really the only way to effectively protect your company and its data. But resilient infrastructure, in addition to cyber, is equally critical. You're going to hear the term from your IT guys, business continuity, disaster recovery. You have to presume cyber is going to fail, because at the end of the day, the SVR's got 1,000 hackers who are far smarter than I'll ever be. And so, God forbid they get through, you'd better have a high fidelity copy of your data somewhere that they weren't able to hack for the day that cyber fails, both for high availability and for disaster recovery. And that also then speaks to network design and management. I mean, so all of these things interweave. Next slide. So, when people start talking about cyber, I would be remiss if I don't remind you that there is a mind-numbing array of choices. You can't read this chart, don't bother. The folks at Momentum Partners put this out every year, and it's one of my favorite charts, because they take each of the areas of cyber and then they start flashing all the logos that have been populated there. And you can see it's hundreds of companies. Here's the problem. There's no silver bullet. The ads that you see on TV during the Super Bowl with the Iron Owl and things where they go, hey, buy our solution and guess what? You'll never be hacked, is patently absurd. It's patently absurd. The whole notion of cybersecurity is, if you will, a parfait, not just of technology, but of policies, procedures, controls, process, systems, management, and indeed culture, a culture of cybersecurity. Next slide. So, up until now, a lot of clients would go, well, I'm going to do it myself, or I'm going to self-insure, and that's great. But here's what you're signing up for. You and your cyber team, and often, depending on how big you are, your team may just be a guy. You have to pick out of that blizzard of logos an entire reference technology stack. And why is that important? Why is it not one thing? Well, let me confess. We use Kaseya. And so we use Kaseya for patch management. We were the first ones notified by Kaseya that it got hit, and it didn't matter, because our reference technology stack, we killed the hack before it ever hit us, because we have an entire reference technology stack. And our analysts were all over it, and because we have a full technology stack, we were able to shut Kaseya down and go on about our business with alternate forms of patching and management. That's what comprehensive cybersecurity is all about. So if you do this, you're going to have to sort of pick your own stack, and then everyone thinks it's not me. Our average client, and we've got clients ranging from small businesses to large businesses, is getting hit 4 billion times a month. And you go, that's not possible. Trust me, it is. We've got, we ingest all this data. It's literally billions per client. And by the way, if any of those get through and lock you down, that's got an average price tag of about $2.5 million. Okay, next slide. So to be effective, you've got to not only pick a stack, you've got to add what's called a SIEM, which is security and information event management. It takes those 4 billion things and it reduces them down to a manageable set, typically 1,000, right? And then you got to process those 1,000. And which means you got to have a basic IT cyber infrastructure. You got to have a detailed cyber response plan. You need to have things like multi-factor authentication. Remember, you can get these slides, you have to write this down. And then you have to have an overall cyber risk management policy. And when you've done all that, congratulations, you are now insurable. Andreas will take your call. But are you safe? Next slide. Here's the problem. The most lethal threats don't always fall under standard coverage. So state-sponsored attacks, you'll hear that exclusion. Andreas talked about it earlier. Cyber terrorism is increasingly excluded. Well, what's cyber terrorism? Why do you care? The SolarWinds attack, the Kaseya attack of July 2nd, likely state-sponsored, and I just use likely in quotes. It was the SVR. And so maybe excluded. Ransomware limits, sublimits are being implemented. What does that mean? You really don't want to have to pay a cyber-related ransom. That's what that means. And lost portable electronic devices may not be covered. What does that mean? Well, are any of your employees working remotely? And do any of them have phones or tablets? If so, that's important. Next slide. So to truly be safe, not just for the stuff that's insurable, but also the threats that are actually probably lethal, you've got to be able to respond to threats all the way down to the response level, which means I got to take those 4 billion events, I got to drive them down to the 1,000 that I need to care about. Then they're probably out of that 1 in 100 is an actual incident, an actual thing that if you do not respond to, you're toast, you're hacked. And so then you've got to have a team that can actually respond, right? And that you must figure out what the threat is and remediate and do so in real time, right? This is not something you can kick the can down the street. You got to do it right now. Next slide. So in order to do that, your cyber team, if you talk to your own guys about, hey, tell me about what we can do and what we can't do, here's the things that they should be able to come back to you and say, yeah, boss, here's what we can do. Cybersecurity analysis, cyber incident detection and validation reporting, management and maintenance of our cyber solutions and tools, which have to get better all the time. Threat intelligence analysis, cyber intelligence reporting, incident response, etc. There's a whole set of things. This isn't just about buying endpoint security or buying a firewall. There's a whole infrastructure that has to be put in place. Next slide, please. And the only other point I want to leave you with is that, again, is the one we started with, which is cyber's table stakes, but it's got to be integrated with the other things that you're doing. What does that mean? So your business continuity, disaster recovery, and your networks all need to play together with cyber. Your business continuity, disaster recovery, that's also not standalone. It really only works if it's integrated with cyber and at the network layer, which means your network, your compute, your storage, all of that has to be aligned. Because what hackers look for is they attack you at the intersection of those things. So if they're not integrated, if there's white space between the two, that's what they're going to drive through. And by the way, our main attack surface, particularly since the pandemic with work from home, as well as the earliest indicator of when there's an issue, are your users. And you probably have a help desk, service desk. That also has to be integrated because the users are going to call up with real information. And if the service desk doesn't pass that back on to the cyber guys and go, by the way, I just had this weird thing that looks like a phishing attack because you know, a junior person in the organization got an email from the CEO asking him to please send the credentials for the treasury account at Chase Manhattan Bank. Happens. And by the way, don't forget, your users are now using an explosion of mobile devices to work from home. So all of the above has to be integrated with an affirmative strategy for managing your users' mobile devices. It's no longer okay to say, well, you know, Steve has his phone and great, dial into our systems and knock yourself out. That doesn't work anymore because the hackers are attacking your users where they live, and then your users are using their phones and their tablets to access your systems. And where it used to be, you had one point of connection, your corporate headquarters. Now you've got hundreds of employees sitting out being bombarded every day. Mary Beth?
Excellent, thank you for that. So now that we've covered that technology foundation and considerations, Andres, can you take us through additional building resiliency strategies that you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, I think this is the easy part of doing, one of these sort of sessions with Steve and folks from DataPrize, because it's easy to agree with everything that Steve just said. So ditto is my initial reaction, but it's true. You highlighted a lot of great points, and the integration and sort of the enterprise-wide component of it is really the main aspect that we're seeing. And it's really rethinking, I think, how many organizations, and especially the C-suite, view cyber and cybersecurity, right? It's not an IT issue, it's not a technology issue, and it's not just about protecting PII or PHI, or the privacy and personal records. What we've seen is that really, and the statistics show that since 1975, there's really been a shift in terms of the value of companies, right? Facebook, Google, they're no longer based on physical assets, what we call PP&E, right? Property, plant, equipment. Their biggest assets are informational assets, digital assets, big data. Yet those are the assets that they're not really always focusing on protecting, and they show that they're the ones that are least insured in many scenarios. So when you're thinking about your cybersecurity structure, everything that Steve outlined needs to happen, and it needs to happen across the enterprise as well as across the different key areas of operation and classification of data categories. So that you're looking at what are, redefining the crown jewels and looking at whether it's intellectual property, whether it's looking at key vulnerabilities are going to be looking at the business interruption component of the organization, the business impact analysis. All of these areas and quantifying your cyber risk is something that companies aren't really doing too well right now. And it's not easy to do necessarily, but if you're able to quantify your exposure and identify your areas of vulnerability, then you can take the framework that Steve outlined and all of those components and start deploying them in a more strategic manner that help you better protect the business and guarantee that operational continuity. For us, the resiliency is about operational continuity, and we'll talk about how insurance helps to kind of facilitate that in some way, but it's really about knowing kind of what are your assets, what do you have at risk, and kind of going through that analytical process. And if we go to the next slide here, it also, cyber risk is an area where, in terms of quantifying the exposure and the costs associated with it, and helping to rationalize the investment in the security stack and the services and these outsourced resources that are vital, it's understanding what are the total costs included in a breach. You have your costs around the detection and escalation, which are the more understood areas, and those are typically ones that a standalone cyber policy or coverage will be sure to provide some component of insurance for. But you also have hidden costs, and the hidden cost is, again, where you're looking at things like reputational risk. There's potential lost contracts or revenue or clients that can result because of a breach or because of a business interruption issue. Going back to Colonial Pipeline, they shut down for roughly about a week or so, I believe it was, and that had a catastrophic effect across the Eastern Seaboard for disruption on suppliers, other businesses, even consumers that couldn't get gas or had to pay added costs at the pump. So there's a whole set of knock-on effects that occurs with cyber risk and disruptions to the business that are not necessarily contemplated as in the direct immediate impact. Similarly, any kind of lost data, intellectual property, and increases in insurance premiums like we've talked about, those are all things that have to start being factored in, because ultimately companies need to realize if they're able to incur these costs on their own, then great, don't look at tools and resources like insurance, and you can better deploy your investment into the security stack or other areas. But if not, and most companies don't, middle market companies particularly, don't have that type of balance sheet to incur that type of seven-figure breach costs, they need to really know and be able to quantify these types of hidden associated costs.
So now let's get into some more depth on how insurance plays a role in mitigating these risks, or preparing for them, I suppose is more the appropriate way to say it. So the baseline question.
Yeah, the main thing is, what is cyber insurance? And it's been around now, I think, for 20 plus years. It has evolved as the threat has evolved. But the main thing to understand with cyber insurance, as Steve was talking about, the cyber risk framework, the policies, the security stack, cyber insurance is not going to be a defense mechanism, right? It's not going to be risk management. It's not going to be a risk control. It's not going to be a preventative issue to a breach. But it's a way to really help build the financial resiliency for the organization. It's a way to transfer the cost incurred of a breach, like any insurance policy, and put it off of the company's balance sheet and into the insurers. It's different in that it brings a whole host of additional resources to the table to help be more proactive and mitigate that cost. It brings primarily the breach response resources, which are critical. So that's where it differs a little bit. But much like the slide that you shared, Steve, which I love, with all the different security companies out there, and if we go to the next slide, we kind of see a little bit of this. Insurance is the same. There's a whole range of different types of cyber insurance policies out there, and they're not all created equal. They're not all providing the same level of coverage. So we break them down into sort of two zones. The ones that we see in the danger zone are what we call either the bundled policies. And this is where you might take out, especially more for smaller entities, you might take out a business owner's policy or general liability type policy, and they have some level of cyber insurability attached to it. But that is only going to really provide minimal protection around third-party liability risk. It's not going to give you the resources or the tools to bring your organization back online. Similarly, there's policies around EDP, or electronic data processing. These are geared more towards actual equipment and hardware. The area that we recommend clients go to is the standalone cyber insurance policies. These are the robust policies, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of all the coverage components, but the policies that provide that liability perspective, they provide the resources, the breach response, and the other key components that help ensure the organization, including the disruption of revenues and business. And when you start getting into complex levels or larger organizations, you start having these towers or stop loss layers that can be added on top of standalone policies, providing the same level of robust coverage. That's really where folks should be going and looking for insurance. If we go to the next slide here, you can see that cyber insurance can be a little bit complicated, as this visual shows, because it covers a whole lot of areas. And cyber is a risk that spans across the entire organization. It spans from the digital to the physical domain. It spans from the IT department into human resources, into the supply chain, third party. So you need a policy that contemplates all these different potential loss scenarios and can provide coverage for it. Whether it's again, extortion components or social engineering and what we call e-crime, which is, as Steve highlighted, those fraudulent transfer requests, whether it's the breach response components of bringing the team in, reputational risk, all of these things are able to be covered, as well as first and third party risks. The main areas for resiliency and interest for companies is around the business interruption component, and not just the company's direct business, but what we call contingent business. So as you mentioned, Kaseya and its impact on Dataprise, there's coverage for that. And these policies can provide that type of coverage, but you need to be able to take that detailed strategic view of the organization and have a really analytical view of the types of policies and coverage components you need to bring into the equation. There's also exclusions. So there's also, areas and pitfalls to watch out for. And these are increasing as we're seeing the market right now. Third-party providers. This is a big red flag for all carriers. And it highlights the need, they're not necessarily providing coverage for a lot of the breaches caused by vendors, but it also highlights the need for companies to really have third-party assessments done and carried out, to have those protocols and standardized requests of their cybersecurity policies in place. Portable devices, as Steve highlighted, another area where if they're not encrypted, they're not going to be covered. It's kind of a pretty boilerplate approach. The cyber terrorism, again, if it's not stated in the policy, it's not going to be covered. And with cyber, because it spans so many categories, they're not if they're not stating it, insurers are denying these claims, and it's creating a more litigious environment where you have to go to court to try and get your claim paid. And lastly, it's really, we're seeing more increased scrutiny around security standards. The problem with that is that the insurer is not defining it. So if you don't define it up front, it's an area where potentially you're running afoul of their perceived standards, and it can create, again, exclusions or gaps in coverage. And these components, it's not that they're guaranteed to be an exclusion, but in this environment, it really requires the expertise and the in-depth sort of resources and skill that Steve outlined with kind of that a data prize or managed service security provider can bring to the table, and aligning it to the insurance coverage so that you can bring in some of these components. You can create a more robust policy and really provide insurers a greater visibility into that security stack and understanding of the technologies as well as the threats, because that's where they're facing a lot of their friction, and it's resulting in this limited coverage, right? They don't have that visibility, that data readily available to them. So collectively, we need to create a more integrated strategy and an aligned strategy that can better represent the risk, and clients can reap the reward. And I think if we go to the next slide, it just shows as well how cyber insurance is more than just your standard insurance policy. Typical policies, you look at it once a year and you renew or you utilize it when you have a claim. With cyber insurance, they bring a whole set of additional resources and proactive measures and tools that companies can leverage, from blueprints around disaster recovery plans to embedded proactive cyber assessments and training workshops. But the requirement is that companies look at cyber on an ongoing basis, right? As the threats evolve, the plans and the protocols evolve and adapt with them, and training is reinforced. Because for utilizing those proactive measures is a way that insurers can help limit the potential of a breach, or if it does occur, at least limit the cost that they're paying out, so it's not a seven-figure loss driver for them. So they're very eager to promote partnerships with MSSPs. They're very eager to work with companies like DataPrize and provide proactive resources so that companies can build up their overall cybersecurity postures and hopefully limit or reduce the costs incurred by a potential cyber claim. So a lot of stuff there.
That is, and we have some questions that have come in, which is perfect. But before we get to those, I wanted you both, some final thoughts, key items that you want to make sure that people are taking away from this conversation. Steve, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Hopefully, take this presentation and use it as a checklist for your own organizations. I would encourage each of you to sort of interrogate, it's maybe too harsh a word, what it is that you're doing on the IT infrastructure front as it pertains to your cybersecurity. Do your due diligence and make sure that you have a comprehensive approach. Because if you don't, bad news will abound, because ultimately there's no one who's too small. There's no vertical where the hackers don't care. They're trying to get every server all the time, and they're good at it. By the way, when I started here as the CEO, within 2 hours of my starting, my CFO got an email from me that was a phishing attack. So it took them 2 hours to figure out that I was the new CEO, and bam, the phishing attack started. By the way, they've continued unabated for the last year. So please, 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 if you do nothing else, go figure out what you're doing on this front, and get to the point where you can feel comfortable that all of those items that you need to get done are getting done. Andreas?
Yeah, I agree. I think if every organization, regardless of size, needs to look at cyber risk as a strategic business risk, right? And I think evaluating it on that basis, you're able to then prioritize your investments and your spend on cybersecurity, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, right? I think your comments just now, Steve, highlight that even organizations that specialize in this area, even government entities via SolarWinds, everybody's potentially vulnerable, and especially with the human component, it's one click away from a ransomware attack. So everybody has that. If you have email, you have that cyber risk, and being able to be prepared is now the new minimum requirement to be able to even get quotes for cyber insurance. And I don't think that's going to go away in this market, at least not for the next few years. So it's viewing it as a strategic risk, and then also making sure that you're having all your various cyber-related components, whether it's a data prize, national security service contract, speak to your insurance, to your broker, and that's how you're going to be able to really develop a robust cybersecurity structure.
Excellent. And so one of the first questions we have here ties into that reference of how does the security technology that you have in place impact the underwriting and insurance decisions? And perhaps, I know you've referenced that it definitely plays into it, but are there certain areas that they're looking at, or their impacts on limits, premiums? I imagine you get this question and see it often. So what guidance do you have for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think in the current market, it's the requirement, right? So you have to have certain components, or you're not going to even they're not going to entertain a quote. Carriers have gotten very, very selective. Things like multi-factor authentication, it's a core requirement, a standard that if you don't have that, you're not going to be able to get to the next phase of it. Encryption is going to be another area where you're going to need to have those components in place. You're going to need to have that disaster recovery plan. You're going to need to be able to demonstrate in this current environment, not just that you have those plans in place, and this is for companies of all sizes, right? So it's not just if you're a $1 million small entity, you're still going to have that question in your application of, do you have a business recovery plan? Do you have a business continuity plan? Do you have multi-factor authentication? These are the new minimums. And if you can't demonstrate that you have those and that you're utilizing them and updating them, then carriers are not going to take those risks on anymore. We're already seeing some carriers like AXA XL in France saying that they're not going to take on these new risks, and they're not going to provide ransomware protection. So the market is shifting, and these are the minimum requirements. In terms of pricing, that just where the market is and where carriers are, it's anybody's guess. It's at 35 to 100% rate increase, right? There isn't a standard approach, and that's part of the problem. But that's also the way that working with organizations like DataPrize, we can start providing that information and hopefully start getting a bit more of a standardized process and some more price certainty into the market.
Excellent, thank you. And Steve, I want to bring you in on this one, and then Andres, I'm sure you probably have perspective, but the question is, we're having trouble getting our board to take cybersecurity seriously and allow us to make the appropriate investments. How do you recommend we get leadership to fully embrace the severity of the situation?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a pithy, brilliant answer. We had 2 weeks ago. Sorry, behind me, I have a conference room. We had the president and CEO of a national chain of healthcare centers. I don't want to tell you what kind for confidentiality reasons, but the CEO went, like the board you just mentioned, said, why can't I just use the guy that the IT guy recommended? And the president went, the IT guy recommended was a $60,000 a year resource. And he said, great, $60,000 a year resource, why can't he do that? And the president said to my head of our cyber operations, what's your background? And he gave his background, which is pretty impressive. And he went, and by the way, we have 12 of those, and we have $1 million worth of tools. And that's the problem, which is the number, if you do it yourself, the number is frankly staggering. Because for a 300, 400, 500 person company, buying the tools, assembling a comprehensive team to do all the things that I enumerated, is pretty costly. So basically, the conversation comes down to make buy, and doing it yourself. Absolutely, anybody out there can do it themselves. And at a certain level, I mean, certainly if you're a Citibank, doing it yourself makes far more sense than finding a vendor to do it. But in the mid-market, tends to make more sense to consider, getting some help. And then it becomes difficult. You really need to ruthlessly interrogate the credentials of the folks and the capabilities of the folks that you're talking about, because like so many things, you get what you pay for, and making sure that they actually have all of those things that I enumerated, making sure that they have a reference technology stack. So even if they use, like us, Kaseya, they still didn't get hacked because their technology stack, killed the attack at its root. So that takes a level of interrogation that often makes boards a little queasy. Where I always tell people to start is find somebody to do an assessment. Like, just figure out where you stand. Do an assessment, and 80% of that will, I think, be repurposable for the purposes of talking to Andreas and his colleagues about a quote. But figure out what your actual risk is. Figure out what the investment needs to be, if not in dollar terms, in terms of tools, people, technology, to get you safe and get you to the point where, to Andreas's earlier point, you are in fact insurable, and one of his cadre of insurers will in fact take you on as a client. Andreas?
Yeah, I think I think the current market conditions, I think insurance may be that stick or carrot, whichever way you want to look at it, right? But if they can't get insured, I don't think companies are going to have the luxury right now. If they're looking at cyber insurance, they're not going to have the luxury of saying we can't invest in certain things if they're not doing it, because then they're not going to be insurable, to Steve's point. But I think aside from that, it is a challenge, and I think a third party can sometimes get that validation that internally is tougher to do. So getting, I think, support is a great recommendation. The other area where we've sort of helped organizations is in trying to put some financial quantification behind it, right? So that you can say, beyond just PI and PHI that we talked about, if you do a business impact analysis, or if you can really start quantifying your third-party vendors and supply chain and disruptions of what that might cost, then you can start saying, okay, well, we can withstand having 20,000 records be impacted at $100 a record. But can we withstand a week of shutting down our entire operation, meeting payroll, and these other components? So then investing in both the security stack and the services and the insurance, all of that can start being rationalized. And I think the C-suite, sometimes when they see it that way, it clicks a little bit more, because like insurance, cybersecurity is an intangible service that is tough to quantify in many areas. But if we can start honing it into the business impact and how that translates to dollars and revenue and continuity efforts, it might help build the argument.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andreas. In fact, the little example I was giving you of that chain of healthcare centers, I mean, I think one of the things that ultimately tipped the scale is I said, how many patient records do you have? Mm-hmm. And he told us, and I went, okay, just did the math, which is under HIPAA. If you leak a record, it's about $150 a record. And I said, so you have 100 million plus exposure. Somebody hacks and pulls your entire record list, which turns out is in a single file, you're writing a $100 check. And by the way, there's no wiggle room there. As you know, HIPAA's going to go, congratulations, please write us a $100 million check. So, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So this other one that we got is asking about whether cyber insurance can actually make you a target. And I assume that the background here is the assumption that, hackers will say you're more likely to pay the ransom since you have the insurance to do so. Andreas, are you hearing that? Or if you aren't hearing it, how do you address it regardless? I assume it might be a myth, but maybe it's reality.
Yeah, no, it is a constant question, and I think it's a valid question in all fairness, right? But we put cyber insurance in the same category as kidnap and ransom insurance, right? It's something that if you have it, you shouldn't go around talking about it or promoting it, because that makes you a bigger target. At the same time, you know, cyber criminals and ransomware, it's a business, as Steve, I think, alluded to earlier. And, you know, there could be an opportunity for them if you are victim to a ransomware attack and you pay it, that you'll come back and they might hit you again. But it also, you know, there's a couple of other kind of counterpoints to that. And it goes back to this sort of weighing the pros and cons and the company's own ability to withstand these types of attacks. Because, you know, if you have the financial means to absorb those losses as a company and you're willing to do so and your risk threshold is there and your data is backed up, then you might not be as concerned with a ransomware attack. And then maybe cyber insurance, you might not need to get a robust policy, or you can do without it entirely. So it's going to depend a little bit on that front. I think the majority of companies don't fall into that category, especially, again, the larger section of the middle market companies. So I think in that sense, it's kind of a safety blanket, right? And you would have that extension made available to you. I think the other part of it is also the two more parts. One is cyber insurance goes beyond the just ransomware, right? It has multiple layers to it, and it's those breach response resources, the business interruption resources, all those other components that need to be factored in as well in that sort of impact analysis. And lastly, you know, if you are victim to a ransomware attack or a breach or what have you, and you have a policy and it kicks in and it pays the claim, any company should always be then taking a chance to do a post-mortem, look at what happened and improve and fix those vulnerabilities. Because just because you have the insurance that we talked about before, insurance in itself is not the risk management, it's just a risk transfer. So you need to make sure you're improving those things, reinforcing it. Just like with kidnap and ransom, if you're going to be walking around very sketchy areas where there's a lot of kidnappings happening, you're likely to be kidnapped. So if you don't change that pattern, that's going to happen again. So it's more onus on the companies than the criminals out there doing these types of attacks, I think. So it's a roundabout way to say it depends.
Excellent. Steve, anything you want to add on that one?
No, I always find it, it's a bit akin to a burglar coming through your house and saying, well, if he knows that you've got a policy that covers theft, he won't break into the house, and if he does, then he will break in because he knows you're covered. They're breaking into the house. That 4 billion number I showed you, they're hitting every server that they can possibly find, which is pretty much all of them. They're hitting every server all the time. So they don't know a priori whether that server is tied to a company with cyber insurance or not. Once they get in, if they're able to get into, Andreas's firm, Risk Cooperative, such that they can figure out that he has cyber insurance, well, guess what? They know everything about you, every single thing. So that's what they'd have to do in order to figure out if you have cyber insurance. So you're basically saying it doesn't make much sense to me from a technical perspective, because if somebody breaks into my house and they see a gold ingot sitting there, I kind of suspect they're going to take the gold on their way out. Maybe not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, we covered a lot of grounds, and I know we could keep going on, but being cognizant of time, I want to thank everyone for attending. I especially want to thank you, Steve and Andreas, for joining me on this conversation. We will send the copy of the recording, the slides, as well as some recaps to everyone who attended. And thank you both. Great conversation.
Thank you all. We appreciate you taking the time.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Bye.